What Can't Be Unseen, Seeking Justice Beyond the COVID Apocalypse. This is the last of my ReEmergence series that I've been doing on Tuesdays this month. You know, we are looking at, Long Beach is in the yellow tier now, and it's likely enough that within a month we'll be in, well into reopening, certainly in the wider Long Beach community, if not at First Church itself. We're taking those steps forward to regather. And so I wanted to give us an opportunity to think theologically about what it means to re-emerge from this long COVID winter. And on the first session, we talked about finding God or the devil online. We talked about the values and pitfalls of using the internet as a way to connect and to do church. Last week, we talked about keeping faith in pandemic times and thinking about, how do we hold grief and how do we think about where to find God in the middle of disasters like the ones we've been experiencing over this last year and a half. And this time kind of caps it all off to get us to think about, what is our response to the justice issues that have been raised by the last year, because it's not just the virus that's been a struggle. It's been all of the problems of inequality and all the problems of social injustice that have arisen alongside it, and that our focus has become trained upon in the last 18 months. Maybe for the first time, but maybe we're realizing some stuff that was always there and needs our attention and intentionality moving forward. And so my question for tonight is, the idea of the apocalypse. It's kind of a loaded term. It's a much misunderstood term. And I want to take a look at what apocalypse means in the Bible, in the Christian tradition. I want to talk about the way that apocalypse is used in our broader culture. And I want to hopefully show how the Bible's stories and the biblical idea of apocalypse can teach us something important about how to look at the systems and the structures of our world, and how to understand our calling as people of faith to build a better world and to live in a better world, and to point toward hope rather than the four horsemen of the apocalypse, all of whom we've seen way too much in these past 18 months. So it's a talk that'll go in a bunch of different directions, and I hope you'll go in those directions with me as we jump right in. And tonight, because we're talking about questions of social justice, I would like to just have a moment for us as a group. If you want to just tell me right now, what injustices in the world are on your mind tonight? We know there's an awful lot going on, but are there places in the world where there's conflict, or are there issues tonight that you're particularly thinking about as we're entering into this kind of theological and philosophical conversation? Steve, I see your hand up.
Absolutely outraged and saddened and all kinds of other emotions about Palestine.
Yeah.
That's heavy on the heart.
Yeah, Israel and Palestine and the horrible violence that's going on there. Absolutely. That's been a lot on my mind. It's something we talk about a lot in our family. Satya and her family are Jewish. So it's a big, it's a big, hard topic of conversation for anybody who has that connection to the place. Absolutely. Dottie, I think I saw yours next, and then Yvonne, and then Jane.
Yes, a little bit closer to home than Israel-Palestine, which of course is also on my list, is it's certainly not new that both food and access to medical care deserts that have been punctuated. Certainly not new, but the lack of access to vaccines and good nutrition on an ongoing basis, as well as again, another punctuation mark, the distrust of the medical system by certain of our communities who've been badly used and misused over the historical past. So very local, neighborhoodish.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Those are both those are I think particularly I'm thinking of the issues of health disparities and distrust of the medical system for some very good reasons. There's some things that are actually going to get brought up tonight, but I'm glad that you're holding that for us and inviting us to hold that with you. Then Yvonne's hand was up.
Steve and Dottie both already got in with my two main heartbreaks right now. With my background being Egyptian and Jewish, it gets really kind of messy in there with Hamas and Israel. And then, of course, being Black, the distrust of the medical profession. And on top of all that, I can't get India out of my mind. The horrors of what it looks like over there. And we have people just willy-nilly refusing to get vaccinations over here, and people are dying hand over fist there for want of vaccinations.
Yeah, it's good to remember that even as things begin to look better here, that that's not the case everywhere. In India right now in particular is really, really suffering. Still, it's still a public health catastrophe over there. So thank you for calling that to mind, Yvonne. And then Jane had her hand up, I believe, and then Judy.
Yeah, I just would add to all of those things. The violence toward Asian Americans, and because I have two nieces that my sister-in-law adopted from an orphanage in China, and I've seen those girls grow up, and I mean they're career women, they're contributing members, citizens of the U.S., and I'm so proud of them. I mean they can, I suppose, defend themselves, but it's just kind of shocking to me that there's such racism and hostility toward that particular community, and especially toward the elderly and those that are newly to this country. It's just it just seems like one more thing to add to this. It just seems like COVID-19 has uncovered so many things that are well, good and bad. I think there's been a lot of heroes during this whole thing, but it's brought a lot of fear and ugliness out in some people too. So,
yeah, thank you. And that's, we were talking a lot about that, I guess, about a month ago after the violence in the South, but it's still worth remembering that it keeps happening. Just because things go out of the news cycle, it doesn't mean they go away. Judy, and then I saw Pam's hand go up, which I think means all of us will have had a chance to add something. Go ahead.
All of that too. I mean, it's hard to there's so much, but what's been dear to my heart is the anti-LGBTQ bills that are coming up, as well as the, some tenuous, with the gun laws and everything like that. Every time I think of a thing, it's another thing. But just a lot of things coming up through the legal system are kind of scary, I think, in retaliation or whatever with all the political upheaval. So that is kind of widens, but my first concern is the LGBTQ things, as well as all that other stuff. Both and.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. That unfortunately, justice issues have to be kind of both and. It all matters. And then Pam, you had something for us.
Yes, I'm concerned about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict also, and I think it ties back to Iran and how they fund a lot of these terrorist organizations. And Israel has the right to defend itself. The fact that they're being bombarded with hundreds of missiles every day, I just find appalling. We would go ballistic if that happened to us.
Thanks. I know that, the Middle East is, for want of a better word, a bit of a mess. And there are lots of reasons for that, including, the wars that have riven that part of the world for a long time. Steve, did you put your hand up anew?
Yeah,
ahead.
just, I don't want to prolong this, but I couldn't disagree more than the last comment. Not equal.
Yeah, I think there is, I mean, let's hold both of that, right? Let's hold both the struggles and the fear that Israelis are experiencing. And also, I mean, I happen to agree with Steve that I think that it is an unequal situation pretty starkly in Israel. And, you know, the two things can coexist and be really difficult at the same time. So what I do want to honor that there is difficulty, there is complexity there. My cards are on the table, but I think that it's good to have both voices speaking into our space tonight, because I think one of the things that tonight's talk is going to bring out is the way that a lot of these things are interconnected, right? And that we, in service of, you know, in order to unravel some of the justice issues and in order to reveal them, we have to think globally and we have to think systemically. So thank you for that. So bearing all that in mind, I do this on purpose at the beginning of these sessions because I talk a lot about philosophy and literature and biblical studies and history. And there's a danger of that getting, in my opinion, a little theoretical if it's not grounded in the real experience of people fighting for justice in the world, and if it's not grounded in the real experience of us who are trying to figure out how to respond to it. So even as we go back and we're going to look at the Middle Ages and we're going to look at the 1930s and we're going to think about the first century and who was writing the apocalypses and how understandings of that have changed over time. We're going to think about COVID-19. I just want us to keep in mind that these are not abstract things. Theology is not abstract. It really bears upon who we are and how we respond to the world around us. So keeping that all in mind, let's go ahead and let's get into it tonight. So I'm going to start with a historical digression about Galileo of Galilee, and you're going to bear with me here. This may not seem like the most logical place to start a talk about COVID and the apocalypse, but I think you'll understand why I went with it. So in case you don't know, in case you didn't learn about it in elementary or middle school, Galileo Galilei was living in the 16th and 17th centuries. He was a physicist. He is best known as, he's called the father of modern science. But what I want to draw attention to in my little talk here is he was living in Italy and was one of the first people to use telescopes to look at the sky, to look at the heavens. And he was the first person, at least in the West, to observe the moons of Jupiter. So he saw that there were moons orbiting the planet Jupiter. And he noticed that when you looked at the moon, you could tell that it had mountains on it, that it was not simply a flat disk up in the sky, but that it appeared to be a planet unto itself, or it appeared to be planet-like unto itself. And this, during his time, was absolutely revolutionary. He wasn't the first person to suggest that maybe the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. There had been actually philosophers going back to ancient Greece who had thought the same thing. But more recently, Nicholas Copernicus, who was a Polish, I believe, monk who had suggested a heliocentric view of the solar system, saying that the sun is actually at the center and all the other planets revolve around it. This was in conflict, of course, with the Catholic Church's doctrine, which held that the Earth was the center of the solar system and, in fact, of the known universe. And you can see the picture there. On the right-hand side here is an example of a geocentric universe.
We can't actually see anything.
Oh, you can't see anything? It didn't share
We just
again.
see our own pretty faces.
Oh, you're all lovely, but you can't see the image.
We are.
Okay,
Well,
boy.
but we can hear
boy,
you.
Yeah,
You're taking a picture with your words, which is
oh, how lovely. How lovely. Boy, I'm really rocking the tech tonight, folks. Thank you so much. Lol. Hold on. Let's see. I want you to see this this geocentric universe. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Ha. Okay. Fabulous. Cool. Here you go. With visual aid this time. So if you can take a look at this and you can see that's the way that at the time the Catholic Church and most scientists believed that was the way the world worked, and that the planets and the suns and stars all orbited around the Earth, the center of the universe. And in 1633, the Catholic Church's Inquisition took Galileo and took him to trial for heresy. And they found him guilty. They found him, they said that he was guilty not only of theological heresy, but of spreading lies and was mistaken. And they were forced him actually to recant. And Galileo did recant on pain of death and spent the last several years of his life officially having gone back on the observations he had made through his telescope. And there's a really interesting point here. This is why I'm bringing up Galileo, is that it's not like the Catholic Church didn't do their research on this. It's not like the Inquisition didn't do their research. Actually, the Vatican astronomers repeated Galileo's observations. They took his telescopes and they looked at the sky where he had looked, and they saw the same things. They saw the moons around Jupiter. They saw the mountains on the moon, and still they condemned him. And I want to, this question that I want to ask is, how could they, who were, these were highly educated people, deny the evidence of their own eyes? How could they take a look at what Galileo had seen, see it for themselves, and still condemn him for heresy? Well, there is a saying, Sinclair Lewis put it into words, but you've probably heard it before. It is very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it.
Yep.
You might say it is very difficult to get a man to understand something when his power and prestige depend upon his not understanding it, as the case may be. And certainly for the Catholic Church in the 16th and 17th century, it was in a bit of an embattled position. It was, so during the trial of Galileo, it was 30 Years' War, which, hey, it turns out that even the Black Death wasn't the last time that Christianity dealt with a major pandemic. The Bubonic Plague was a huge factor in this war that tore through Europe from 1618 to 1648. There was plague ravaging besieged cities. There were widespread famines. There was such horrific violence that 8 million people were killed over the course of these 30 years in this conflict. Up to 60% of the population of certain parts of Europe died. And this was, the 30 Years' War was motivated by a couple of things. One was the rise of capitalism and colonialism. So the economy of Europe was changing quickly and dramatically. The political system was changing from the feudalism of the Middle Ages to the more modern economic systems that came up during that time. And of course, this is also the time of the conquest of the Americas and the doctrine of discovery, which was the church's doctrine that in order to spread the Christian faith, countries could travel to the Americas, to the quote unquote new world, and colonize the indigenous peoples there. You've got a picture here of conquistadors of Hernan Cortez, actually, and battling the Aztecs in Mexico, what would become Mexico. And this all resulted in, this was a time of total social and political upheaval, because it was also the time of the Reformation. So about a century before this, we have Martin Luther with his 95 Theses nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg. That's in 1517. And the war in Europe was a result, at least in part, of religious conflict, as different principalities chose to be Lutheran, or they chose to be Reformed, or they chose to be Anglican in the case of England, or they chose to be Catholic, and consequently got into wars with other neighboring principalities who had different religious systems. And so the Catholic Church at the time when it tried Galileo was experiencing a crisis of spiritual and temporal authority. It already felt as if the earth were moving underneath its feet. And for people, for men who were accustomed to being on top of the world, who are accustomed to the power and prestige that comes with that, Galileo's suggestion that, well, actually the earth is moving under your feet. Actually, your entire view of the universe is fundamentally backward. In fact, the earth is not at the center. In fact, the sun is at the center of the solar system, and we'd come to find out that the solar system isn't even the entirety of the universe. It isn't the center of the universe. We're a blue speck flying through space. And so the way that, I'm simplifying a lot of complex history here, but the church experienced this. I would say the church hierarchy experienced this as a complete crisis so what? The entire world's changing. We're moving from feudalism to capitalism. We're moving into this world of Reformation and Protestantism, and the Bible might be wrong, or at least our interpretation of the Bible's cosmology might be wrong. It must have felt like, to them, the end of the world as they knew it. Turns out it's not the only time in history that people have felt like it was the end of the world as they knew it. Certainly not people in power. And so the reason I bring up Galileo at all tonight is because of a play by a guy named Bertolt Brecht. Now, Brecht was a German dramatist. He was a socialist and a dissident in Germany who fled the country in 1933 because, like other left-wing dissidents, he would have been targeted by the Nazi government, who, in addition to hating leftists, also hated, as you know, Jews and Romani people and LGBTQ folks and the poor and the disabled. And actually, if you kind of go down a list of the people we were just talking about, who we were trying to keep in mind tonight, that's not they're on the Nazi naughty list. But Brecht wrote actually a play called The Life of Galileo that details his trial, and he wrote this in 1938 and revised it in 1945 through 1947. And he's writing about, hey, the power structure is looking around at the world and denying the very nature of reality. Clearly, these people can see what's going on around them. He's writing in the context of, you just seen World War I and this sort of orgy of imperialist violence, the Great Depression as the world economic system collapses, leading into the violence of World War II. You're seeing totalitarianisms in both the left and the right in Europe and throughout the world. We come to know that there's this brutal systematized violence going on in the Holocaust. You've got the end, kind of the anti-colonial struggles throughout the world, the invention of the atom bomb. Old religious systems no longer seem to make sense of the world as we know it. And the response of people in power was to effectively close their eyes and to say, no, actually, the world isn't that complex. No, actually, the problem isn't that we have a broken economic system, or the problem isn't that that hierarchy and war haven't actually solved our problems. The problem is the Jews. The problem is Romani people. The problem is the other, whom we do not like and whom we need to outcast. Right? It was a similar. Brecht saw it as very similar to the way that the church could look at the moons of Jupiter and still say that Galileo was guilty of heresy. And so the play was a critique of the powers and principalities of his time, the idea that they could somehow make the truth not true by denying it. The truth will out. And there's a couple beautiful quotes from the play, and this is why I really bring it up. It's these two lines. One of them, speaking about what happened, speaking about sort of the response to Galileo's discoveries, is no force can make what has been seen unseen. No force can make what has been seen unseen. And that goes along with a phrase in Italian that Galileo is reputed to have said after his trial. Eppur si muove. So he's been forced to lay his hand on the Bible and swear that he is a liar, that he was incorrect, that he was purveying falsehood, and that he now understands he's done the wrong thing. So he's been made to recant his findings. And it's said that he walked outside and stamped his foot on the ground and said, Eppur si muove, which in English means, and yet it moves. And yet it moves. Because it turns out you can only deny the truth and the evidence of your own eyes for so long. And it turns out that even the church ended up having to admit that, yeah, Galileo, kind of was right, actually. And this picture of Earthrise, the famous picture taken in the late 60s from one of the Apollo missions, considered to be the most influential photograph ever taken, our first real picture of the Earth from space. Really beautiful, one of my absolute favorites. So the idea of apocalypse is very much this sense of there is no force which can make unseen what has been seen. The Greek word apocalypse comes from apo, which means un, and kaluptein, or cover. So literally apocalypse just means uncovering or unveiling or revelation in the sense of to reveal something. We think of it often as the end of the world, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But in its actual literal sense, it just means uncovering. It means revealing something about the way the world works that maybe we wouldn't have seen otherwise. And it is a genre of biblical literature. We actually have a number of examples of it, written primarily between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. So the most famous is the Book of Revelation. Don't worry, we'll get to it. But there are others in the Bible as well. There's Jesus' quote unquote little apocalypse, which is found in Mark 13 and has an analog in most of the other synoptic gospels. Some of the writings of 1st Thessalonians would be included under that. The book of Daniel with its visions of the Son of Man, or one like a Son of Man. Some of the visions of the prophets like Ezekiel could be considered apocalyptic, using this vocabulary of powerful and unnerving and unsettling symbolism and metaphor and poetry to portray the, if not the end of the world, at least the end of the world we have created. To paraphrase Father Richard Rohr, he says it's not meant to strike fear in us as much as a radical rearrangement. It's not the end of the world, it's the end of worlds, our worlds that we have created. And with the images here, I've pointed out that it's hardly only an ancient genre. You'll see this all throughout Hollywood. Post-apocalyptic films are a very popular genre, perhaps because sometimes we feel like the world as we know it is also ending.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to focus on the Book of Revelation as our biblical example, just because it's the longest, the most extensive, and the wildest. So you may know some of this. This may be basic stuff, maybe you don't, but I think it's worth going over anyway to give our biblical text a little bit of context. So the Book of Revelation was written by someone named John of Patmos, and scholars think it was written in about year 96 of the Common Era. John was exiled to the Greek island of Patmos because he was a Christian, and this was a time of intense persecution of Christians, probably during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, but he was looking back to the times of his, particularly to the persecutions of Nero and other Roman emperors. And even if Christians weren't being persecuted at the levels that they would be in the years immediately prior to his writing the Book of Revelation, and immediately following, during the 2nd century of the Common Era, this is a time of massive religious upheaval for anyone who's rooted in the Hebrew tradition. So about 25 years before this is the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which leads to the Jewish diaspora and a complete reconfiguration of the way that Jews understood their religious identities. To our point from earlier, the mosque that the Al-Aqsa Mosque that the Israeli Defense Force or Israeli police, I can't remember exactly which force, went in and hit folks with rubber bullets and tear gas. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is built on the Temple Mount in the place where the Second Temple would have stood during Roman times. So it's the holiest site in Judaism, one of Christianity's holiest sites, and the third holiest site in Islam. Evidently, people have been fighting over this particular hill for a very, very long time. And at that time, the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jewish people and the persecution under the Roman Empire would have seemed like the end of the world as they knew it. And so John was writing, to quote Rachel Held Evans in her book Inspired, which some of you might remember from last week, the Book of Revelation was written to real people living at a real time in history, asking very real and pressing questions about their immediate circumstances of uncertainty, of fear, circumstances of persecution and instability. And Held Evans points out that he's writing in an idiom that would have made sense to his readers and his listeners. There are more than 250 references to the Hebrew scriptures in the book of Revelation. So while it seems bizarre and coded to us today, to its hearers at the time, it's likely enough that they would have understood a lot of it handily, which is good for them, because I don't know if you've read the book of Revelation, but it's bananas. The monsters and murder and mayhem. There's rivers of blood and a lake of fire, giant monsters with 7 heads and 10 horns, 7-eyed lamb opening up 7 seals. The moon is as blood, and the sea shall give up its dead. It's the stuff of apocalypse movies, as a matter of fact. I don't know that I've seen many Hollywood movies that can quite match the almost hallucinogenic quality of some of the stuff in the book of Revelation. And it also contains, right there at the end, those last couple of chapters, some really beautiful language about the New Jerusalem and a new heavens and a new earth, which I just want to put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. And, we think a lot of folks, especially since the 1830s, have thought of the book of Revelation as a kind of, it's a handbook for the end times, right? This is showing us exactly what's going to happen at the end of history when when Jesus finally comes back, and there's the battle to end all battles. And in fact, this is at least part of why Israel is so important in evangelical circles, is because they believe that in order for Revelation to happen, in order for the prophecies of Revelation to come true, there are some folks who believe that Jews have to occupy the Holy Land, and war actually has to happen, and so that the conflict in the Middle East is a good thing because it's a precursor to the end times. That is more than I have time to get into tonight. That is a class unto itself. That is a book. That is a bunch of books. I'm not going to get into that too much right now, except to observe that the book of Revelation, our best guess is that it wasn't intended at all in the sense of these are the actual things that are going to happen at the end of time. Rachel Held Evans in her book frames it in a way that a lot of scholars and theologians now have, which is as resistance literature. At the time that the book of Revelation was written, we have to understand that, the language of eternity and the language of the Son of God, that was language that was used by Rome to describe Caesar and the empire. The Son of God was a literal title that Caesar used. Rome was the eternal city. And when the book of Revelation and other Christian texts say things like Jesus is the Lord of lords and the King of kings and worthy is the Lamb, there's a very, very strong undercurrent here of resistance to Rome, because if you say that worthy is the Lamb, worthy is Jesus, Jesus is Lord, well, that means that the emperor isn't. The emperor is unworthy. The emperor is not the king. Revelation as a text, with its absolutely bizarre and horrific imagery, I would argue is revealing, it is unveiling Rome and the systems of domination of the world for the monster that it is. End times, not so much. Catherine Keller, who you may also remember from last week, who's a theologian and professor, writes in her book on the mystery that an end in Christian eschatology signifies purpose, not termination. And eschatology, for those unfamiliar, is the study of last things. It's when we talk about things like where is the universe headed, what is the ultimate intention, the end times, or the sort of the end of history. What is all that stuff about? How do we make sense of that? That's eschatology. And her argument, and Richard Rohr's and Rachel Held Evans and a lot of scholars and theologians and mine, is that it's about the end of this world, not the world. Revelation is telling us that God's ultimate intention for creation is not death and domination, but life and love. You see this in the beautiful imagery of the book of Revelation, and that empire and violence thwart that intention, and that it will ultimately perish, that evil cannot win the day. The book of Revelation is a kind of promise that, as powerful as Rome may seem now, it too will pass away, and that when everything's said and done, the love of God and the kingdom of God and the reign of God will be what remains. And so with apocalyptic literature, the idea is it's showing us something that we can't unsee.
Mm.
When you see that Rome is the monster with 7 heads, when you see that Caesar is not the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, then that requires a response. Do you accept what you've seen? Do you allow that to shape your intentions and your actions in the world? Or do you deny it? Do you deny the evidence of your own eyes and your own heart? So, after a year like the last one, let's talk a little bit about the evidence of our own eyes. Let's do a COVID-19 greatest hits, and by greatest hits I mean worst hits. So doom scroll with me for a second here. So as of, I got my data yesterday, this number may have changed as of writing, 33 million cases of COVID in the United States and 586,000 deaths. And if you were in the class last week, I had different numbers. That's 4,000 more deaths since the same time last week. So a reminder that while the crisis is ebbing here, folks are still dying on the daily. And in the world, it's 163 million cases and 3.38 million deaths. Again, those numbers will have risen since I got them just yesterday. Mm. And this is an image of a mass grave in New York because of just the complete overwhelm of the medical system to treat the number of people who were hit and who died of the virus. It is maybe we're a little bit distant from it now to think about that, but the horror that we were seeing at this time last year of these kinds of mass graves and having to set up field hospitals in Central Park. And I'm sure some of you can remember scenes and news reports from what was going on down there in Southern California, which was one of the other epicenters of the virus. It was truly, truly apocalyptic stuff, truly end of the world kind of stuff, feeling like it. This has had huge economic impacts in the last year. 22 million people lost their jobs. Nearly 15 million people lost their health insurance right in the middle of a pandemic. This is a breadline you've got here. Folks lining up to get access to food because they can't afford it, because they've lost their jobs, or because their benefits weren't sufficient to carry them through. And all this while the richest handful of people, billionaires in the United States, have gotten richer by $1.3 trillion during the pandemic. So there's been a massive transfer of wealth from the poorest in society to the wealthiest in society. That's still the case, even if we're starting to see the economy open back up and jobs are being replaced. Still, people are feeling the just massive economic inequality that's resulted out of this pandemic. We've also, of course, seen the Black Lives Matter movement come raging back to the fore as we realize that the problems of police violence and white supremacy have in fact not gone away. And talk about a revelation, right? Just almost exactly a year ago, we saw the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the movement that broke out in the middle of a global pandemic in the United States calling for racial justice was perhaps the largest protest movement in US history by sheer number of actions and participants, right? So it's been this moment of a reckoning for our country with its legacies of slavery and segregation and racism and the prison industrial complex. And this is also, excuse me, before I go on, this is also a place where race and COVID intersect. Kind of to Yvonne's point, is that people of color are significantly more likely to die of COVID than white folks. Actually, for Black folks, it's 1.4 times as likely. And that can be put largely down to the health disparities that already exist between communities of color and white communities, because communities of color tend to have those kinds of not just food deserts, but healthcare deserts, and be generally, on average, lower income and less wealth in those communities due to the impacts of systemic racism. So these things intersect. Oh, and by the way, I don't know if you remember the part where the actual sky went red and the moon was as blood, and in the middle of a global pandemic, the air quality was the worst anywhere in the world, and you couldn't go outside because if you wore the COVID mask, it wouldn't keep the smoke out, but if you wore the smoke mask, it wouldn't keep the COVID out. Yeah, that happened. That was the part where it's like, okay, yeah, no, if the four horsemen ride out of the clouds tomorrow, I'm not even going to be surprised at this point. 10.2 million acres burned in the wildfires of fall 2020, almost $20 billion in damages, at least 37 people died. And this is where the interruption of climate change comes in, because it's not as if climate change stopped happening while we were having the COVID crisis. Actually, it's the same forces that created climate catastrophe are also those that are exacerbating the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. And then, as if to put it, and we were all kind of hoping that 2021 might be a new year, and then we have the right-wing authoritarian violence at the Capitol. We have talk about kind of an apocalyptic movement. I could do an entire class on QAnon and the conspiracy theories. Actually, you get people who do in fact believe that the Earth is flat and that Galileo was wrong. Nowadays, you have to explain to people that the Earth is round, actually, and just the way that we've had this seeming explosion in right-wing violence and in hate against people of color and minority groups. And now with bombs exploding over Israel, over the literal Holy Land, again, like apocalyptic is apt language, I feel like, at this point. And then on top of that, you get leaders who, I'm just using Trump as one example, who don't seem interested in looking at the facts, who seem ready to deny the evidence of their own senses if it will prop up their power and their control just a little bit longer, right? This is taken from a photo op when Black Lives Matter protesters were cleared with tear gas so that the president could, the ex-president could take a photo op in front of an Episcopal church, who later denounced him as saying that he did not represent the values of that religious community. So bring this all together, and you've got yourself a nice apocalyptic stew. And to quote another Episcopalian who published a compilation called "We Shall Be Changed: Questions for the Post-Pandemic Church," COVID has dramatically revealed our society as one already suffocating. It's the end of the world as we know it. So do you feel fine? I promise I'll get us some hope out of this, but what is your response as you look at these numbers, or as you've been experiencing this last year? Where do you find yourself? What do you find yourself thinking and feeling as we talk about these kinds of the positively apocalyptic feeling of the last year, Yvonne? Gonna need to unmute yourself, Yvonne.
Most of these inequalities and images of horror I've been aware of most of my life. I mean, Black kids grow up with it. We've always known of it. But on the other hand, the world has been ending since it began. For each ending, there is a beginning. Yes, racism is still prevalent in the United States, but there are more people with open minds now than there were when my parents were alive, than there were when my grandfather was born a slave. So things change, and in order for things to change, things have to end. You must have an ending before you have a beginning. And when they happen at the same time, it's ugly, always.
I'm just going to let you teach the class from now on, Yvonne. That's you put the second half of the presentation in a minute or less. Yes, absolutely. And it's so important to remember that things can and do and have improved. That's really, I mean, it's easy in the face of that kind of horror to think that this is totally new or that it's never going to change. So it's good to have that longer perspective. Thank you so much. Dottie.
I have to see if I'm unmuted. I think I was blessed to be born with a father who believed the glass is half full. I adopted that philosophy. I've seen many an ending and beginning. Nothing like this one has been in my lifetime. But I think for me, part of the secret of happiness, if there is such a thing, is finding some balance. The only moment I can live is right now. I can't live yesterday and I can't live tomorrow yet. But I want to make tomorrow better than it might be if I didn't do some kind of an intervention, whether it's climate or race issues or health issues or economic or whatever. So I think that tension of what can I do in the moment and what do I need to do towards tomorrow is part of what keeps me going. Whether it's social justice issues, I've been an activist in the LGBT community for, let's see, since 1975, so a while. Some big, some little. So I'm conscious of that. I was in the women's movement before that. I was in the prisoners movement before that, the economic justice movement before that. So, you know, I've seen a little bit of all of them. And I think Yvonne's right. You know, we want some things to die. And there, because of inequalities, some people will always want different things to die. So again, there's another tension of it. It's how do we come up with a balance of the people who do take risks and keep business doors open? Yes, they do need to be acknowledged, but not 400% more than their lowest labor wage people. So again, it's balance and the tension that sort of drives me, and I have hope. I'm not sure why, but I do.
You don't have to know why with hope. Sometimes it's just enough to have it. Thank you. Thank you, Dottie. Any other reflections that have come up? You know, I hit us with a fair number of kind of ideas and images and stuff there, but I want to, if people have questions or just are thinking about, you know, this idea of the COVID apocalypse. Anything else that's coming up for people?
I think our two spokeswomen said it the best. Ditto.
Ditto. All right. Well, in that case, then I'll move into our second half, where I hope that I can capture as eloquently a sense of hope out of Jane. Did you have something? You just unmuted yourself.
Oh yeah, I did.
Yeah.
No, I think it was well said. It's kind of overwhelming. I mean, I think I was reading this great book about just the history of money and commerce and how people made a living. It's called Debt, and part of
David Graeber.
Yes, you know that book.
Great one.
I love that book, and it's a powerful book. I mean, he covers the whole sweep of history and how people used to just barter for things, and how debt became, you know, criminalized at some point, you know, and you can get thrown in debtor's prison. And anyway, that's a different night too. But I always trace a lot of our world problems back to economics somehow, you know, and people doing things that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily do because they're forced to, you know, find a way to feed themselves. I don't know. It's just, yeah, the whole, it was just seemed like one thing on top of another. So I'm looking forward to the hopeful part tonight. Just, you know, with the sky turning red, that last, you know, when the fire started, on top of the, you know, just the inconceivable number of people dying. I still can't, you know, you showed that picture of that mass grave. I still can't really conceive of that. And I am humbled at thinking about healthcare people that, you know, they went in where literally I feel like angels were feared to tread. There's just so much has gone on this last year. It's hard to conceive. And but I did like what you said, that it might be end of this world and not an end of the world. So maybe there's a new world for all of us if we just pay attention.
So may it, no, thank you. So may it be, in fact, yeah, I think one could actually teach a church class on David Graeber's death, the first 5,000 years. That'd be fascinating. But I think, again, I hear people with hope, and I'm glad to hear that. I'm going to try to give a little bit from my perspective as a theologian and a thinker. And so I'm going to jump back in with you here to our presentation. And this time I'm going to wait for confirmation to make sure you can see what I can see. So am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so let's go back in. Do you feel fine? Well, I think most of us are probably somewhere in that orange to red part of the pain scale, at least as regards the last year. So what do we do? What do, to quote a YouTuber I like, it's intentionally ungrammatical. And I want to think about, what do we do? How do we respond? How do we deal with the apocalypse? How does one go on living after the apocalypse? How do we respond to the injustices and to the horrors we've seen in the last year? And I can't hope to do that in another 32 minutes in any kind of systematic way, but I do want to offer some thoughts. And one of them comes from thinking about the genre of apocalypse as we write it and talk about it and see it in movies in the 20th and 21st century. And I'm drawing here from the work of a YouTuber named Jack Saint, who did a video called The Ideology of Apocalypse. And often in the face of disaster, we see this in all sorts of movies. And probably you've thought about it, or in the face of, maybe you've had these thoughts in the face of disaster. The assumption of much apocalyptic literature, contemporary at least, is that humans are selfish. Without a coercive state or some sort of centralized authority, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. You probably heard the quote by the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who was writing actually not around the same time that Galileo was being tried, that the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. You can think here of films like Mad Max, Fury Road, or the book Lord of the Flies by William Golding, where the group of schoolboys get stranded on an island and quickly devolve into savagery as they attempt to survive together. And there's a theological implication to this kind of thinking about people, that if we don't, if you take away the 911 and you take away traffic lights and you sort of take away the centralized authority of the state, that we're going to devolve into chaos. And the underlying theological implication is that people are sinful and they need judgment and redemption. So if that's your working assumption about human beings, that we're selfish and nasty and brutish, then the end times and apocalypse is a moment of judgment. It's a moment of purging all of that sin and nastiness. And my question I want to ask is, well, does that assumption hold up in the real world? I don't think any of us is going to deny that people can be selfish and can be nasty and can be brutish, but is that the way that we always are or have to be? And particularly in cases of disaster. I want to just use this really quick example. So The Lord of the Flies, as I said, it's a book written, I think, in the 1950s, classic. Probably you may have read it in high school English at some point. And its idea of a group of young men being stranded on an island and how they respond to being deserted castaways. Well, that actually happened once in the early 1960s. It was a group of young Tongan teenagers. You'll see them pictured here in the photograph, and they were stranded. They went out boating and got stranded by a storm on an island for 15 months. And in contrast to The Lord of the Flies, where it was a war of all against all, and the kids were just absolutely brutal to one another, they actually ended up forming basically a little commune. They needed to be able to survive on the island, and the only real way to do that was to cooperate with one another. You can see one of them has built a guitar or some sort of stringed instrument out of driftwood. They talk about them practicing basic medical care with one another and splinting each other up and taking each other's share of the work if one of them got injured. It's a great real world example of, people don't always actually behave at their absolute worst. in cases of disaster and apocalyptic situations. And that's the subject of a book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Solnit. The subtitle is The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster. And there's this idea of the disaster community, or what happens in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. And she wanted to test this theory because she was writing in the immediate aftermath. She wrote this book, it came out in 2009, but she was writing after Hurricane Katrina, devastated New Orleans and the really bungled government response to that. And she wanted to ask the question, the reporting around Katrina really focused on looting and anarchy, but was that actually the dominant experience of people on the ground? And she kind of comes out in the book with the thesis that, well, no, actually, not only in the case of Katrina, but in many disasters throughout history, turns out people can be pretty incredible, actually. And she writes, how you behave in the event of a disaster, or really in the world generally, depends on whether you think your neighbors or fellow citizens are a greater threat than the havoc wrought by a disaster, or a greater good than the property and houses and stores around you. And she talks about these disaster communities as little glimpses of paradise. Paradise is made in hell. And she goes and she finds that in situations of crisis, people sure can be selfish, but also they can be altruistic and cooperative, and that those moments can actually evoke that in us. She goes through a number of examples: the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, Hurricane Katrina is mentioned, 9/11. You think about the heroism of people in Katrina, the Cajun Navy, as hundreds and thousands of people with boats came and rescued refugees from the drowned city. And the Mizpah Cafe was the name of one among dozens of soup kitchens that opened up organically in San Francisco after the catastrophic 1906 earthquake there, when much of the city was on fire. Millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people were homeless and destitute, and the way that people basically rose up to meet each other's needs. And actually, there was this interesting way, the idea of emergent integration. That's actually a term that I coined when I was putting this together, because one of the really interesting things about these disaster communities is that questions of class and race and gender tend to fall away in the face of needing to deal with a crisis. And so particularly in the San Francisco case, you had Black dock workers and folks from Chinatown and white workers all were in the same soup kitchen lines and were working all together to put out the fires that raged through the city. And in her research, Solnit found that it's often the people in power who are the worst behaved during crises. You can certainly take a look at the way that this panned out in the COVID-19 crisis, as leaders kind of did it in many places, at least, not everywhere in the world, but certainly here, did a pretty miserable job of dealing with the crisis. And Solnit posits a couple of reasons for this. One is elite panic. They don't like the loss of power and control. It is the end of the world as they know it, and no, they do not feel fine. There is perhaps some projection. Their assumption about people is that working idea that they're selfish and they're self-interested just like them. So of course they're going to behave like a ravaging mob, and of course they have to be kept in place with force. And you can see this in the FEMA response in New Orleans in 2005. You can see it. There was a great quote from the book about the absolutely catastrophic response. The army was sent in and the National Guard to deal with the San Francisco earthquake, and succeeded in basically setting way more of the city on fire than otherwise would have burned if the people had been allowed to just do it voluntarily. Not to say that if the army or a concerted response couldn't have helped, but that it didn't, and that it often doesn't. And so you see these kind of contingent, emergent communities popping up in the midst of the absolute worst possible situations. And she points out how this can have, these things don't last forever. Once the crisis goes away, often we will return to our customary ways of doing and being. And it's not like San Francisco became a classless, anti-racist utopia in the wake of the 1906 earthquake, just for one example, or that, New York continued to be a classless, anti-racist utopia in the wake of 9/11. Obviously, that's not the case. But these events, she argues, Solnit argues, can spark, it can let us know that this kind of thing is possible, that this kind of altruism is possible, and it can really transform people in ways that have reverberations far beyond the event itself. And one of the examples she offers from San Francisco, which is one she spends a lot of time on, so that's why I'm referencing it so much, is Dorothy Day, who was the founder of the Catholic Workers Movement. She was an incredibly influential religious voice for peace and justice. She, all through her life, was active in calling for an end to war, an end to violence, for justice for the poor and oppressed, for mutual aid. And she was living in Oakland at the time of the 1906 earthquake. She was, I think, 8 years old, living there with her family, and it exercised a really huge impact on her. And this is what she writes, that Solnit quotes in her book. What I remember most plainly about the earthquake was the human warmth and kindliness of everyone afterward. For days, refugees poured out of burning San Francisco and camped in Edora Park and the racetrack in Oakland. People came in their night clothes. There were newborn babies. Mother and all our neighbors were busy from morning to night cooking hot meals. They gave away every extra garment they possessed. They stripped themselves to the bone in giving, forgetful of the morrow. While the crisis lasted, people loved each other. While the crisis lasted, people loved each other. There's something there about what human beings are capable of in the face of great stress and strain. And it's not to discount human selfishness and human greed, but it is to posit that there is another way of being, and that we catch glimpses of that perhaps in the very midst of crisis. And so I want to suggest a different kind of apocalypse. And really, you were getting at it, Yvonne, already so well and so much more succinctly than I'm going to. Paul Tillich, who some of you may know, is a German-American theologian from the mid-20th century, so writing after the horrors of World War II and the Great Depression, but before some of the more recent crises we've been talking about, struck a distinction between chronos and kairos. He's talking about two different conceptions of time. So chronos is the time that we measure in things like dates and hours and minutes. It's linear historical time. So it's what we typically experience on the day-to-day. And when you read history books, they're often written in terms of chronological time. Kairos, on the other hand, is what he calls God's time. It is the opportune moment. It's the way that, when you're in the middle of the simplest activity, you can suddenly become aware of the presence of God, or when you find yourself in exactly the right place at the right time to hear a word of comfort or to offer one, or suddenly you realize at this moment, perhaps like Dorothy Day in Oakland in 1906, that this is going to change your life forever. You're in the right place at the right time to become something more, and to perhaps get a peek into the world that God envisions for us. This is the opportune moment. This is kairos. And for Tillich, the apocalypse isn't a chronological event. It's not something that happens in history. It's not the end of time. Rather, it's a kairological one. And he's going to use some German existentialist religious language here. I'll translate it, don't worry. Everything conditioned is judged by the unconditional. The appearance of the new is the concrete crisis of the old, the historical judgment against it. Tillich was really concerned about the way that we make things like wealth, or the state, or ego, or leaders, or political ideologies, or the institutional church into idols. We make them into God. And what he's arguing here is that a moment is apocalyptic when it reveals that our idols have feet made of clay. When it reveals that the things we have called God, whether that is our political party, or whether that's our limited conception of God, or whether that is our faith in our economic system, or our faith in the belief that God punishes the undeserving and rewards the deserving. When those ideas, when those things, when those people, when those institutions are revealed to not be what we thought they were. They aren't God. Actually, they might be monsters, right? They might actually be monstrous and worthy of condemnation. And for Tillich, this is something that happens at the personal level, the systemic level, the cosmic level. And so an apocalypse is something that can literally happen anytime. Any moment has the potential to be one in which we say, oh, the old needs to die and to pass away in order to make way for the new. And so you could say, not always so. This was the saying of Suzuki Roshi, who founded the San Francisco Zen Center in the 1960s. Not always so, Rome. You're not the eternal city, actually. And not always so, US Empire, you're not the eternal city. And not always so, white supremacy. Not always so, patriarchy. Not always so, church, right? Not always so, because none of you are God. None of you are the ultimate. None of you is the real reason we're here. You may have good things about you, but when we begin to identify those things with God, that's when we make the mistake, when we begin to identify Rome or the president or our beliefs with God. That's when the apocalypse happens, when it needs to shake us out of our normal way of thinking and doing and being. And Rebecca Solnit points out that in its original sense, catastrophe didn't even mean something bad that happens. What it meant was a plot twist. The idea that what we call catastrophic for the ancient Greeks was just to describe a moment when things changed dramatically in a narrative. And I had to sneak in the Tolkien reference. I always will. I will always find a way. J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Lord of the Rings, coined the idea of a eucatastrophe, the joyous turn. So when you're in the middle of a story and things seem dark and things seem hopeless, and suddenly there's that moment where the light breaks through, when it didn't seem possible, where God makes a way out of no way, where a light shines in the darkness. Those moments where in the depths of despair, hope arises. That's the kind of apocalypse I can believe in. And so the idea of the eucatastrophe, the joyous turn, that's what Revelation ends with. To come back to scripture, that's what the book concludes with. In the 21st and 22nd chapter, after this horror show, after all these apocalyptic things that we see mirrored in our own experience over the last 18 months, then we get the vision of God's creation the way God intended it. And I just want to read it because it's one of my favorite parts of the whole Bible, right there at the end. And then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them, and they will be God's people, and the Holy One, God's self, will be with them. Yes, God will dry every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who is seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." That, to me, is the kind of theological language that gives hope in the midst of the kind of year we've had. Maybe not the end of history, but the idea that even out of the horror and the darkness, that something good can come, that those disaster communities can form, that we can see the spark of human goodness and altruism, that we can find God even in the middle of it all. But instead of preaching to you about that, I just want to ask, have you seen any hell-built paradises during COVID? Have you seen examples of that kind of people showing up for one another, whether communities or individuals, that Solnit talks about in her book? What do you hope we don't unsee in the aftertime? How can we turn this COVID apocalypse into a eucatastrophe? How can we take the lessons that we've learned and seen all this injustice in the world around us and not simply deny the evidence of our own eyes? So those are the two. I'm going to fuse those into two. One is, where have you seen glimpses of that quote unquote hell-built paradise? Where have you seen glimpses of those disaster communities in the last year? And how can we not simply unsee what we've seen? How can we take seriously what's been revealed and unveiled? I want to offer that up for folks to reflect upon. I have some takes. I always have some takes, but I think that the wisdom of the group is larger than my own. So Yvonne has her hand up. I think we might need you to unmute yourself.
Actually, my hand went up quite a while ago when you brought up the Lord of the Flies.
Oh,
and the
yeah.
Tongan boys who were stranded. The thing that occurs to me is the upbringing of children in Tonga is a hell of a lot different than the upbringing of children in Britain.
Yes.
You have people growing up in a community where things are shared and people care for one another, where community is the ultimate, as opposed to the capitalist society where it's all me, me, me. So I would not have expected anything else from a group of Tongan boys stranded. But anyway, as for the apocalyptic heaven on earth, I think what impressed me most, what gave me the first glimpse of hope with COVID, was when the cities were experiencing such a hard time getting food for people. And the college students banded together and figured out a way to get food from the farms into the cities for the people who were starving. And, you know, our children are amazing. The kids of this planet are they are phenomenal. The adults couldn't figure out how to get it done. These college students sure did. And so that gives me great hope. Things that I don't want to unsee is things like the Black Lives Matter movement, things like bringing out the concerns of the LGBTQ community, the attacks on Asian Americans or Asians, period. Just the hatred that is expressed to people for reasons that are under no control of theirs and are undeserved. Those kind of things need to be kept in the forefront, because if it's hidden away, it never gets worked on. There can be no change when it's hidden into a dark corner. And we need lights in those corners, as ugly as it is. But we are self-protective. We don't want to see ugly in our lives. So if we don't see it, we can pretend it doesn't exist. So I want those things to continue to be seen so that they will be worked on, so that people will make an effort to try and make the hatred disappear.
Amen. Thank you for all of that. Absolutely. Dottie, you had your hand up, and then I saw Pam.
Yes, this has been very interesting because I have avoided the book of Revelation like crazy my whole life. And ironically, the other church I go to, the Garden Church, which is part of Swedenborgian, otherwise known as the New Jerusalem Church.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's kind of glossed over. We're not beaten up with it, but it's an interesting idea. And the context of tonight's session will make me look at that differently. And that church has done an incredible job of attempting to still service the homeless people that we fed every week for 5 years. we just had our 6th anniversary, May 1st, and I've been part of it for 5 years. So I've seen it happen where, taking care to be careful about the spread of COVID, but at the same time, recognizing that people are still out there homeless or unhoused, a more correct term, and still hungry. So I've experienced that, and I'm fascinated with this whole idea. I've had many apocalypses. I could go on about that, but I won't in the interest of time. But I hope the fact that people are hungry every night is something that does not go away. Once the majority of people can go back into stores and buy food, if they have a job and money, there will still be people who can't. So I hope we don't forget that. And the other thing was, I believe that many white folk are more awake about the evils and reality of white racism, white supremacy. And I hope that is something that does not go back in the closet. I intend to be very vocal about that one, white and all.
Thank you, Dottie. Pam, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Yvonne said. Early on in the pandemic, the food crisis that happened across the country because of the lack of ability to get food, to market, the people that couldn't work because of the lockdown, the 2 weeks stop the spread that turned in to 18 months in some parts of our country. But it brings me, joy's too strong of a word maybe, but it makes me feel good that the ingenuity of the American people in so many respects, how they band together and move to make things happen. Instead of waiting for government to put something together over here, people, neighborhoods will bind together and make things happen. Like Yvonne said with the college students. I mean, there are ways to make things happen. You don't have to wait around for someone else to do it. I have a different perspective on a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to go into that tonight. But I think that all of us have learned something in this pandemic. And I think that there's a lot of mistrust out there. I think there's a lot of false narratives out there. I get concerned when you have media where you have two sides and nobody really gets the truth. There's my truth, there's someone else's truth, and you can't go to one source for facts. It's always someone's perspective or someone's opinion. And I think that's something in the last few years that I think our country has really grappled with. And I hope that at some point we can get to a point where we can agree that these are facts. We're not there. We're not there. And that troubles me. But Tom, you're awesome.
Oh, thank you for that. And I think that question of, what even is the evidence of our own eyes? You're absolutely right. If we can't even agree on what we're seeing, absolutely. I think that's super relevant. Thank you. Steve, you had your hand up.
Yes, I'll just reiterate what Yvonne and Pam said about the people distributing food. That was so heartwarming. And I don't want to forget, just in the same category is the healthcare workers. My Lord, just knocking themselves out, suffering under terrible conditions and giving their lives. And that was so heartwarming, and it still is. And I'm hoping that we don't unsee those things and realize the importance of that. And I hope we also don't unsee the horrible health inequities, and deal with that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Any others before we close out tonight? Things people are thinking. Yvonne, you had something else?
Yeah, there is something that is of concern to me right now, is the states that are cutting off the additional funds from the federal government to their people. I totally understand that they need people to get back to work. But personally, I resent the implication that I don't want to work. I'm going crazy here at home. I want to get out and I want to get to work. They can keep the extra $300. And I think there are more people like me in the United States than there are the folks who want to kick back and just take free money. But right now, yes, there are jobs out there. I've been looking. But in my area, for example, there's a whole bunch of jobs that are paying really low wage. And I'm talking about $8 an hour, $9 an hour. Now, I can't live off of that, but I'm willing to take it just to get out of the house. I need to get the fudge out of here. But there are people out there who still have kids that, if they're anything like mine were, they eat up a storm and they grow like weeds. And you got to feed them, you got to clothe them. They're still trying to pay their rents, their mortgages that went to the wayside while COVID was enacted. I think there needs to be a way to get government officials to understand that they need to give people some time to get the jobs under their feet again, to get at least partially caught up. I don't know about how things are going in California, but there are beginning to be waves of evictions happening in other places because people don't have the money to pay back past rents and such. And now they're going to be out living in their cars or living on the streets again without even that extra little bit of money. And $300 may sound like a lot of money, but I can remember my son, my youngest son, going through $200 worth of groceries in one weekend until I put a lock on the fridge. Okay, so it's scary. And I think there needs to be a way to open up the eyes of our government officials and help people get back to work. And you don't get people to get back to work by giving them slave wages. And when they take away that $300, they're turning people back into slaves again. I'm sorry, Pam, I know we have a little bit of a difference of opinion here, but I also had a grandfather who sharecropped, where you could only buy in a certain store, and it was slavery because you never could get out of debt. I don't say people have to get out of debt, but they just need to kind of get within reach. That's all I'm going to.
Yeah, Pam, would you like to say something?
No,
Yes,
I know, and Yvonne and I have had conversations, and I respect her history and where she's come from, and I totally understand that. But I do have a different perspective, and I'll just leave it at that. But I love Yvonne.
That is nice to see. That is nice to see, actually, because that's a conversation that couldn't necessarily be had in a way that comes from mutual care. And I think that's one of the things that we can do in church. I mean, just a larger commentary is to provide spaces. You know, part of having a shared reality that we can actually name and like interact with together is being able to have the kinds of relationships where we can actually hash things out together and still care about one another. And that's something that I think church really can do. I mean, and I think this question of that you're really raising up, Yvonne, and that all of us are raising up is how do we face the new? Well, you know, because these issues aren't new. They're exacerbated. They're things that have become worsened by the pandemic, but it's not like they came out of nowhere. This is really apocalyptic in the technical sense of unveiling. And so we may have different answers to how to go about that. I know I certainly have some answers, but I think the point of not allowing it simply to go back in the closet and being able to have the like really grapple with these things is such an important part. And I appreciate everyone helping, you know, coming and grappling with it. With me tonight, I have a slide that has some of my thoughts and feelings, but I think I might just put those in my Pilgrim article tomorrow, mostly because I just think y'all have better ideas than me. So you can look out for that. But I do want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, and you know, I want to offer by way of a closing I'll share my screen again here. And there's just a really lovely quote from the poet T.S. Eliot, who used a lot of apocalyptic imagery in his writing, which I think this really speaks to kind of some of the, you know, this idea that we are at the end of something. We're not exactly sure what it's the end of, and we're not exactly sure what will come out of it, but we have reached an end time, if not the end time. And as we reemerge from COVID together, we're being invited to participate in making all things new. And so the quote from Eliot that I want to leave us with is, "And the end and the beginning were always there, before the beginning and after the end." So in the midst of our ending, the things that no longer serve, and our beginning, the things that will hopefully carry this community into a more hopeful and brighter and better and more just future. I thank you for joining us tonight. You can check out my list of sources. There were obviously a number of ones from many places for this session. This has been recorded, and so if you want to go back and check it out or share it with friends, I really appreciate your time, your energy, your enthusiasm, and your wisdom. So thank you so much for coming out. Yeah, go in peace, my friends.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Good night, all. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Tom. You're
Wonderful
awesome.
class.
Good night,
Thanks, y'all.
everybody.
Wonderful class.
Great.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Adios.